you to Testmasters Academy Online. It's organized by Global Quality Leadership Institute, the nonprofit organization whose mission is to become the world-leading advocate for quality and technology. The organization will reach this goal through developing innovative programs on software testing and quality for the tech community, leadership, and educational institutions. Testmasters Online is our new educational project. It includes the series of free webinars and Ask the Experts Roundtable with the renowned speakers in our testing community. It offers new ideas, knowledge, and opportunity to chat and network with software testers around the world. Our other project is Software Testing Conference, Contest NYC, being held November 14th to the 16th in New York City. We invite you to discover emergent trends and practices in software testing and quality engineering. Lay your hands and eyes on latest technologies and immerse yourself into the thought leadership of others in 3 unforgettable days of Contest NYC. Our presenters are senior technologists, managers, and practitioners who are the innovators and experts in their field. The conference is held on November 14th to 16th, 2018. The link to register is in the Testmasters Academy Slack chat. Now we have Joel Montvelisky, co-founder and chief solution architect for Practitest, leading today's webinar on why developers can't test and what you can do about it. There will be time for a Q&A in the Slack channel at the end of the webinar. I'll leave it to Joel to start.
Thanks, Nalima, and you did a pretty good job at my last name because it's very, very hard to say. You can ask my wife if you want to. So guys, thanks for joining. And as you can see, Anna asked me to share my screen, so you're seeing actually my home office. And if there's any background noise, it might be either my dog, my wife, or my kids, so I apologize up front. We're here to talk today about a topic that, again, I have been reviewing it for a while now, and I find it very, very interesting, especially due to a lot of changes that are taking place lately. And it is a topic about developer testing, and I call this session, Why Developers Can Test and What Can We Do About It, okay? Sorry, let's check. Okay, hopefully my screen passes. Okay, so a little bit about me. Why are you wasting your time by talking to me here? I've been doing testing for the last 20 plus years. I started as an accidental tester, I guess that most of us did. Quickly enough, I became a test lead, test manager, got to work on a number of pretty cool startups back in the day, back in the 90s, like 90s, starting at the 2000s. And from there, I just, again, continue working as a QA manager, QA director. I worked for pretty cool companies, both in Israel and the US. And after a while, I decided to, first of all, become a consultant for a couple of months, maybe a year tops. And then I founded, together with a couple of friends, Practitest, that I am the chief solution architect, also QA manager today. In the meantime, I really like to speak around. So I blog, I speak, I tweet, whatever I can. And I have a couple of nice projects that I do on the side. One of them is the online test conf that it's similar to this one. It's actually an online testing conference, and you can check it out on onlinetestconf.com. And together with my friend Lalit from Tea Time with Testers, that he was on a panel earlier, I actually run the online test conf. Which one is that one? The survey, the state of testing survey. Yeah, I got it mixed up already. In any case, so a couple of projects that I really, really like. And just to make sure that I talk about it a little bit. So again, I mentioned Practitest. So without going into it, it's a cool QA management tool, and you can check it out from our site. I won't go too much into it because we're not talking about Practitest today. So first and foremost, I want to start by asking a rhetorical question here, and I want you to think about it. Do you think that developers can test or developers cannot test? Because a very accepted thesis, maybe a very accepted, for some people it's a fact, is that developers can test. But if you think about it, if you look at it, actually that is completely untrue. Developers can test, okay? If you think about it, testing is not really rocket science. Come on, we all learn it. Most of us, most of the old guys like me, we learn by just fooling around and failing quite a lot of it. Okay, then we started reading books, we started doing stuff, but it's not something that if you don't put your mind to it, if you don't put your efforts to it, if you don't read a lot, you can actually go ahead and start doing it and doing it quite nicely. Another thing that we need to take into account is not only that developers can test, but developers are already testing. As I mentioned, one of the projects that I have been running for the last 5 years is a pretty cool survey around the testing community called the State of Testing Report. We ask a ton of questions, we get a ton of answers. And one of the questions that we were asking this year, because a couple of friends who actually brought this question up, it was a cool question, what percentage of your testing is being done by non-testers? Okay? Now, if you notice here, you can see that a little bit over half the respondents, and we're talking about thousands of testers worldwide, say that less than 10%, maybe 0%, maybe 2%, 5% of their testing work is being done by non-testers. But what that means is that we already have close to 50%, around 45% of 43%, sorry, of testing work that is being done by other people, or 43% of people are saying that between 10% and all of their testing is actually being done by your testing work, okay? So this means that people are already doing testing. Now, maybe the most important thing that we need to take into account is that if back in the day, back in the 90s, the lines between testers and developers were very, very clear, if the work between developers and testers was very, very clear, that is not true anymore. Okay, guys? If we look about it, and it is an evolutionary process. It's not something that happened overnight. But if back in the 70s and 80s, the models for development were that we had a clear separation between implementation and testing and deployment. We had what was called the waterfall model that morphed a little bit into the V model, where not only was testing separated from development, but we started having quite a lot of additional testing tasks that we needed to do. So here, we actually made even broader and maybe even harder the separation between testers and developers. As time started moving by, then we started working with other development methods and practices. We started talking about iterative models. We started talking about extreme programming. We started talking about agile. And the world continues shifting and shifting until right now we are in a place where, again, based on the State of Testing survey, most organizations, around 80% of organizations today or more, are already working agile or moved even into DevOps practices. Once you start working agile and DevOps, one of the things that you start seeing is that, again, people start blurring the lines between testing and development. That testers start doing more jobs that are traditional not for testers, even more development jobs. And developers start doing more and more testing tasks. Now, this, you can actually see it also by the way that we're seeing the profile of the tester and of the developer morphing a little bit over time. Okay, if once we used to talk about specialization, now we're talking more about generalization. And I'm sure that all of us have actually seen this type of models, where once we thought that, this was at the beginning, I guess, when I started doing testing myself, we really didn't know quite a lot of anything, but we knew quite a lot of, I got quite a little about quite a lot of stuff. So we knew how to do a little bit of security. We knew how to do a little bit of visibility. We knew how to do a little bit of accessibility testing. And so we were what is called a crossbar individual. That means that we're not very deep on any specialization, but we do cover quite a lot of stuff. Basically kind of a Swiss Army knife where none of the tools are good enough in order to do real jobs, but they're good enough if you just need to wiggle it around, okay? Kind of a MacGyver of sorts. Now, after this happened, we started seeing more specialization, and that is when people started becoming I-shaped. I-shaped meant that we had that person who was only a security tester, that person who was only an automation engineer, that person who was only a load testing development. Okay, these guys didn't have all the additional knowledge, but whatever they were doing it very, very deeply. As time went by, and as we started seeing that people needed to be more modular, and people needed actually to do more jobs, then people started talking about the T-shaped model, where I still had a broad base to build upon. If I'm talking about a tester, then that means that I know how to do most of the testing, at least on a basic level, and I can have one specialization. That quickly enough, people started saying, no, you know what? It's not good to have only one specialization. You do want to have multiple specializations, and it joined what it was called the P shape, where you have either one leg or two legs or three legs, is still calling it P shape. And what people are talking about today is something that I really, really like the name of it. It's called the broken comb shape, where, you know what? I have a narrow knowledge of a lot of stuff, but I also have specializations on multiple layers, okay? And if you think about the typical agile team, typical development team working on a DevOps environment, it's not that you need to be a jack of all trades, but you do need to know enough about enough trades in order to make your contributions. So as a tester, I need to know how to test. As a tester, I need to know how to script, but I also need to know how maybe to deploy my environment on Amazon AWS if we're working there, and I also need to know how to manage and review my logs. So you are not going to be very deep on the stuff. Maybe you're going to be very deep on one or two of the things, but you're going to have knowledge in a number of places. Now, I have been talking about testers all along, but you can have the same approach for developers. It used to be the fact that people knew a lot of development, but not specialization in any language. Then they started having only one language. Then you started having a number of languages. And now what they're talking about is that you need to be also broken comb shape as a developer, where at least part of these layers that you see here are going to be around testing. A developer needs to know how to deploy. A developer needs to know maybe how to contact support and handle support messages and talk to customers. Developers also need to know how to test. Why? Because everyone is doing almost everything in the teams. And if you are doing only one or two things, then you become a bottleneck. And one of the people actually listening to this talk, Mr. Angry Weasel himself, hates bottlenecks. And that is very, very damaging to anyone who's actually going to be in the team. If you have a bottleneck, that means that you're going to be having someone who's not productive in part of your process. That means that you're going to be having someone who basically it's not going to be matching the needs of your team. Okay, so even a developer needs to know testing, just like even a tester needs to know a little bit of coding, a little bit of scripting. But if this is the case, even if the developers can test, and even if I know quite a lot of developers that do test very, very well, fact of the matter is that in a lot of organizations that I talk to, and because of my working practice, I get to talk to literally thousands of teams every year. When you go there, you listen time and time again about the fact that, hey, developers are not testing. Even if they should be testing, they're not testing. Even if they're supposed to be testing, they're not testing. In some places, they're not even being asked to test. Why is this the case? Why is this still happening if apparently there's no reason why developers shouldn't be able to test, or it's even beneficial for developers to test? Well, as I mentioned, I talk to hundreds of teams every year, and when we look into the data, we actually saw that there are three main reasons why developers don't test. And obviously there are more than that, but the three main reasons that we were able to detect were, first of all, that one, developers do not want to test. Two, no one is actually forcing them or making them test. Even if in theory they should be testing, in practice they're not testing, they're always doing other stuff. And those developers that are being asked to test, and they should be testing, we still have some places where these developers actually have some biases, and they actually lack some of the skills that testers have to test effectively. Now, it doesn't mean that they cannot get those skills, but no one is actually actively trying to provide them those skills. So these are the reasons that we're seeing. So if this is the case, then how can we as testers actually help our developers to test? Well, it's actually very simple. If we look back into the three main reasons, then apparently we would need to go ahead and tackle each one of these three reasons. So guys, let's make it simple. The first two reasons, you will need management involvement. Okay, it's not something that you will be able to do on a grassroots work as a tester within the team. Maybe if you are the director of quality, you will be able, but if you're a simple tester, you won't be able. You need to have someone from management who's going to come and tell developers, hey, you know what, guys? You need to go and do part of the testing. And you need to go and make sure that there are no excuses in order for you to do that part of the testing. It can be the VP of R&D, the CTO, as I mentioned, any type of person that has enough authority. If the reasons that your developers are not testing is because either they don't want to test or no one is making them test, then chances are that you're not going to be able to make that much of a change. But what happens about the third reason? What happens about developer biases? Oh, let me put my clock. Developer biases and lack of testing skills, where here we actually have quite a lot of stuff that we can do. Here, as I mentioned, there's quite a lot of things that I have been doing, a lot of training that I have been doing with my testing peers and testing friends on how can we actually help them. And it starts basically by understanding that there are things that are basically getting in the way of those developers testing. And you need to start by understanding them, because obviously once you understand them, then you can start tackling these factors. And it's not as simple as going and telling a developer, hey, you know what? The boss says that you should start testing. So here's the application, go ahead and test it. You may be able to do it, but the amount of testing that they will be doing on this application is going to be very, very, very bad. So let's start first of all by understanding what are those biases and lack of testing skills that are the most common when we talk about developers at this point. The first one, it's actually a thing that I've seen quite a lot, and I like to call it paternal feelings towards their code and the features. Now, guys, I want us to do an exercise here, okay? I'm hoping that many of the attendees here actually have kids. So if you have kids, think about your kids. If you don't have kids, think about your nephews or any kids that you actually know and like. Now, close your eyes and think if you would define your kids, your actual kids, as ugly. Okay, think about it. Are your kids ugly or are your kids pretty? Okay. Now, I'm guessing that most of you thought that your kids are actually quite pretty and definitely not ugly. Now, I want you to close your eyes. Don't think about your kids, but try to think if you know kids that are actually pretty ugly, that are not pretty. I'm pretty sure that everyone actually is nodding their heads, because we all know kids that are really, really, really ugly. Like, Jesus Christ, if they come up at night, I would basically just start screaming how ugly they are. But the fact is that their parents do not think they're ugly. Every one of us have instinctive paternal feelings towards our children, and it's something similar that we've seen when people actually create their code. And I know it because I've done it myself. I'm also a coder. I've also done some coding. And I know that whenever I write a feature, whenever even I design a screen, I'm always going to see my screen as pretty, pretty nice. Okay. And even if there are flaws in there, I will be blinded to them. Okay. In a sense, one of the things that we found is that the fact of the matter is that when people are writing those features, people are writing those screens, if they thought there are any flaws, they already took them out. So you already think that what you have in front of you once you have that end product is going to be, I'm not going to say perfect, but it's going to be very, very good. It's going to be very hard for you to see those flaws. In addition to that, to those paternal feelings, there's also something that is very, very close to it, and it's called inattentional blindness. Now, I'm not sure if you saw this video. If you did, look it again. If you don't, then please pay attention, and I really hope that you're going to be able to listen to my computer's voice. It takes about 20 seconds, I think. Oops, sorry. Oops. Come on, play. Oh, there it is.
This is an awareness test. How many passes does the team in white make?
Go!
The answer is 13. But did you see the moonwalking bear?
Okay, I really, really love this video. And again, this is for cyclists, but intentional blindness, it's something that it's not only about testers and not only about developers. And intentional blindness basically means that if you're very concentrated on one task, in this case, it might be driving, or maybe you're talking on the phone while driving, then you're gonna miss the cyclist on the road. One of the things that we know about intentional blindness is that if you're not looking for those bugs because you don't think that they're gonna be there, it's gonna be harder for you to find them. And so if we're talking about the developer that already has paternal feelings towards their code, it's gonna be very hard for them to be able to find those bugs that are in there, okay? So this is one of those biases that we have. Now, if we look into another issue that it's intrinsic to developers and to the work that they're doing, developers are usually focused on the positive scenarios for everything that they're doing. And it's something that actually comes from the type of processes that we have. If you think about user stories, most of the stuff that is going to be written about the user story, it's about what the feature needs to do. We don't really talk about the negative stuff. We don't really talk about the border cases, the risks in user stories, or at least I seldom see them in user stories. Most of the time, again, we try to limit what we write in there and we go only about what we wanted to do, and a little bit about border cases, but not a lot about negative scenarios. Also, most of the work of developers, most of their efforts when they're working on that feature is how do I make it efficient and effective? How can I write it with the least amount of code? How can I make it reuse part of the stuff that it's there? People spend a lot less time making it more robust. How can I make sure that if there are exceptions, they're going to be caught? How can I make sure that I'm going to be looking for those bugs? As I mentioned with intentional blindness, it's very hard to look for those issues if we're not looking for them. And if, as a developer, I'm actually always looking or trained to look at the positive scenario and how to complete it, then I'm not going to be looking for those negative stuff, negative things that we should actually are going to be calling bugs in our sessions. Moving forwards, there's another issue, and that is the principle of simplifying complex scenarios. Again, we come here about development practices. And again, if you think about it, if I'm a developer, I'm going to get a user story, and the user story is going to give me a story saying, hey, I want the users to be able to do A, B, and C. But when I get to programming, I'm going to be taking that A, B, and C, and I'm going to break it down into atomic functions or atomic scenarios or atomic features. And these atomic features are going to be very, very simple. Remember when you learned a little bit about programming that we had the OR, XOR, and NOR circuits, and we needed to work with them? And how the heck do you actually take zeros and ones and make all the crazy graphical stuff that we're doing today? Everything is built on simplifying complex scenarios all the way to the extreme and building them upon those simple and smaller features. All that is good and fine when you're writing code. But if you think about it, most of the bugs that we're finding there, most of the interesting bugs that we're finding there are actually bugs that come when scenarios become more complex, when you start integrating stuff. What happens again on those border cases? So developers are going to be very good because they're simplifying complex scenarios. If they're good developers and they're thorough, they're going to be doing pretty good unit testing work. But most of the time you will see that as a developer starts going upwards and upwards and upwards on the layers of the system, as the complexity of the test becomes higher, then most developers will stop writing those better test cases. And that is where basically testers can actually do a job better, because when you're a tester and you're given a feature, the first thing that you think about is how can you make it, how can you break it? How can you use complex data? How can you use complex patterns in order to break it? And that is basically the opposite of what the developer is going to be doing most of the time. So we need to teach our developers how to release themselves from that principle of simplifying complex scenarios in order to find the more complex issues. Now, something that it shouldn't be this way, There is no real reason why it should be this way, but if you look at it, it ends up being this way. Is that developers tend to lack end-to-end and real user perspective. And again, I know that there are people who are shouting out loud and say, that's not true. My developers actually talk to end users all the time. But in my experience, when I go outside, most developers are busy on their stuff and they don't want to be bothered by the customer. I love it. I remember a developer having a piece of paper on his cubicle saying something like, the world would be so much simpler without end users. Okay, and that is what they're thinking about. It's like, hey, I made the perfect feature. Why do we need to have end users just breaking everything out? So developers are working more and more on their specific components. If the project is very complex, then they're going to be compartmented in a specific area of the system. They might not even understand the end-to-end functionality. Most organizations, and as we become more and more agile and more DevOps, then this is less true. But I'm still seeing this in a lot of agile and DevOps organizations where the organization makes an active effort in order to separate developers from end users. On the one hand, they think that developers do not know how to talk to users because they're geeks and users are not geeks. On the other hand, they don't want developers to be bothered by end users just asking trivial questions. So we're separating between them and we're making more harm than good. Okay, so this is something that is not happening with testers. A lot of testers spend quite a lot of their time interacting directly with users or working with support on users or professional services with users. So we have that end-to-end understanding, obviously, and real user perspective that a lot of our developer peers lack, okay? And this is also something that we need to fight. Where's Waldo, guys? Where's Waldo is the most exemplifying way of explaining this. How many of you have been testers for more than a couple of months, let's say a couple of years? Okay, I'm hoping that some of you are. How many of you have had it happen that you get a feature, a screen, a system to test, and you realize there is a bug in it a couple of seconds before you're able to actually point towards it? You sense that there's something not good with this, and then you realize that there are a couple of pixels moved there that are bothering you, or that an icon is missing that should be there, stuff like that, that unconsciously you're able to see it faster, you're able to see it better. Those are things that come with experience. It drives my wife nuts that we can be, I'm not sure, again, going somewhere, just walking over a mall, and I say, hey, look at that bug over there. And she goes like, why do you even notice that? And for me, it's second nature. We see bugs jumping at us all the time. And basically, that means that we're broken. We have been looking for bugs for so long that we are seeing them whenever they are, even if we're not actively looking for them, okay? Now, this is not something that, again, it's not a bias, but it's something that if you haven't been doing testing, then you're gonna be lacking, and it might harm you because you do need some experience in order to do a good job at something, okay? So what I'm saying here is that even if a developer wants to test, even if the organization wants that developer to test, and even if that developer is going to be testing, we need to understand that that person, he or she, will be lacking that experience that will help him or her work. Last of the issues, very linked to the one that I just said before, less experience with bugs and application pitfalls. One of the biggest tools that I have in my arsenal is the fact that I have found, seen, and even released a large number of bugs. I've experienced tons of problematic situations, and I've burned myself so bad that I know how not to do it again, okay? It's like riding a bicycle. I always tell my kids, and I have 3 of those, that it's not that you need to fall once or twice. You need to fall 100 times at least before you are a bicycle expert. So start counting those times. Okay, and you learn because you don't want to fall again. So you learn all the ways that you have of falling, and then you learn how to avoid them, okay? And this is what experience does to us. So We might be talking about cases, we might be talking about methodologies, we might even be talking about heuristics and how to use them. Testing is not rocket science, but it's not completely trivial. It's not something that I can take someone out of the street and say, hey, take this application and start working. He might be able to test, but he's not going to be able to test professionally, okay? And all of these are things that our developers, because lack of experience, they are going to be missing. So I talked about all the reasons why developers can test. But let's start talking about how do we help developers actually to test, because at the end of the day, I do foresee a future where not only are developers going to be doing part of the testing, I do foresee a future where, because we're going to be having more developers and testers, they are going to be doing more of the testing. Maybe we will be doing the more complex testing, but developers are going to end up doing quite a lot of testing. And so we need to find a way to help them test better. So how can we, as testers, help our developers to test? First and foremost, guys, and I mentioned this a couple times, and I cannot underestimate the importance of this. It has to start from the top. If management is not going to push for it, it ain't gonna happen, okay? If a developer can come and say, hey, you know what, sorry, I know I should be doing testing, but this other feature is more important, and the director of the team told me to go ahead and do it, too bad, man, I'm gonna just go ahead and do what that people did. Or if the developer just comes and says, hey, you know what, I'm not gonna test, go ahead and make me. And you know that he's not gonna be reprimanded by just undermining that task that he has, then it's just not gonna happen. Okay, so it needs to start from the top, and it needs to be not only a mantra, it needs to be something that it's going to be enforced. Okay, and I'm going to be talking a little bit about enforcement on that, but it has to start from the top. Let's assume for a second that you already have that agreement from the top. You already have management saying, yes, we do want to test. So how can we help developers to test better? First of all, let's start by structuring and planning our testing according to those biases that we saw, according to those weak points that we already know the developers actually have. So if we're talking about the parental feelings towards their codes, let's make sure that we are not having developers test their own features. If you have enough people in your team, cross-test. It's as simple as that. If we know that developers lack experience, even if they want to test, they don't know how to test, let's make sure that we structure pair testing sessions. Let's not throw them into the water by themselves, okay? And I've seen it so many times that you sit with a developer, and remember, guys, pair testing doesn't mean two guys testing one next to the other. It means a session where two people are working with one computer, one keyboard, one mouse, and working together. One person's going to be driving, the other's going to be commenting. And you might start by you as the tester driving and doing half the session by you actually controlling the session and having feedback from the developer and explaining all the time. Explain out loud what you're doing and why you're doing it. And be ready to accept questions and comments. But at one point during the session, you will take your keyboard and you will take your mouse and you will give it to the developer and you will say, now you do it. Now you explain to me what you're going to be doing, and I'm going to be giving you feedback on how to do it better. There's no way people can actually learn in theory. They need to test themselves. They need to experience it themselves. So make sure to schedule not one or two, maybe 3 or 4 or 5 pair testing sessions with developers so they understand what you're doing. And the incredible thing is that once you do this a couple times, you start hearing developers saying, hey, I didn't know you do all of that. Wow, I was not aware that you actually know all that kind of stuff and use all that kind of technologies and methodologies in order to find the stuff. Okay, do it and you will start seeing how developers automatically start appreciating your work a lot better, okay? So that's the first thing. A very simple thing that you can do, and I do it all the time, not only with developers, and I think that that's great. Just as in Agile, we like to do post-mortem and briefings and stuff like that. I always like doing pre-briefings and post-reviews whenever I have a good enough testing task. So especially if I have developers who are starting or even continuing. Before they will start testing, we take 5-10 minutes. We do a briefing session. We understand the objective of their testing. We understand their goals of what they want to achieve. We make sure that they have all the data, everything they need, and then we help them do it. And after they're done, review what they did. Understand what they tested. You will find quite a lot of things they didn't test, and you can give them feedback on that, and they will start learning on that. You will also know that something was not tested, and you can make sure that it's being tested, okay? So don't think that you can just throw testing to a developer and they will do it. You need to make changes, you need to structure your testing, and you need to plan it accordingly. Now, there are also things that we can do in order to make testing easier for everyone, especially for developers. Okay, I'm talking about Testware and helping materials. In my experience, it's very helpful to give developers testing checklists. If you're talking about a feature or sanity test, then go ahead and do it. Just write a checklist of stuff they need to go ahead and check. If you're talking about integrations or APIs, stuff that they need to check. You can also have a library of heuristics. No, it's not only about leaving them there, it's also about teaching them how to use them on your paired testing sessions. It's not trivial to use a heuristic, obviously not on the first time. And again, the difference between a heuristic and a checklist is that a heuristic is something that is very general, where the checklist is very specific for what you're doing. Okay, so this is one of the things that you can do. Another thing that developers tend to miss all the time is testing data. They usually test with either empty environments or with environments with all sorts of gibberish data. Make sure that you have good environments with testing data, with accurate data in it. If you're talking about social security numbers and credit cards, have them handy. Make sure that it's going to be very easy to just take a container and just drop it somewhere, and they can start working with that, or a database time they can actually use with real testing data that's going to help them to test more accurately and to find the realistic bugs. And also something that at the beginning I was not aware how beneficial it is. Define some testing personas. And if you're not aware of the concept of personas, basically it's a profile of a user. Usually every application doesn't have one profile. You can have 3, 4, 5, 15 profiles. But a persona is someone that has a lot more backgrounds. I'm not going to go too deep into that, but if you don't know the concept of personas, go ahead and use them. And in the context of developers, it really helps them to connect a little bit better with the end user, especially if they don't know them. Okay, these are nice tips that will help you actually to help them connect a little bit easier and a little bit faster. Okay, so one of the things that I mentioned is that many times developers lack the tools because the process is not built in order to support testing. So if we're talking about user stories, that they lack negative scenarios and risk assessment data, modify that. Okay, go ahead and make sure that your user stories have a section for negative scenarios. What should happen if? Think about risks, think about integration factors. Stuff that anyone should go ahead and review it and test it, and make sure to populate this information when you populate your user story. Have your product owner be part of it, have your user be part of it. Make sure that they understand that this is important information, important inputs that will help us test better, because just as they know the features best, they also know the pitfalls in their process best, okay? Another thing that needs to be done, and we go back to the point that it needs to be pushed from management. The definition of done has to include a proper definition of testing. For those of you who are not aware of the definition, what the definition of done is, basically when you're working on a Kanban process where you have different user stories that are moving in the Kanban towards being done and completed, there's such a thing called the definition of done, that it means, when am I done with the feature? When can I say that I'm done with it and I can actually move to the next feature, to the next user story? It's very much related to the concept of WIP, work in progress. And it's a mechanism that will help us make sure that we're not skipping over important parts of the process. Now, I've seen places where you have a definition of done saying that some testing needs to be done. What you will find there, it's usually a little bit of unit testing, maybe some integration testing. But there's not going to be proper testing done. So I think that in the definition of done, you need to have a good definition of what testing needs to be done on every feature in order to be considered done. And again, these are things that need to come from above. As much as you want to try to push them from below, they need to come from above, or at least be accepted from above. Now, another thing that is incredibly useful, it's visibility. I think that with visibility comes accountability, and that's pretty simple. If people are going to see a dashboard where they see that you are the bottleneck because you're not going to be doing the testing, then you're going to start being, again, doing that testing in order to stop being that bottleneck. Visibility, just like someone once told me, the problem with metrics is that anything that you actually put on a metric, anything that you make visible, will improve with time. In this case, we're going to be actually doing it in our favor. If you provide visibility into a process, then you will start seeing how it improves, because people are social animals, and as social animals, we want to be accepted by our society. And if we are doing something to harm our society, then it's going to be harder for us in order to continue being social about it. So if you're going to be showing that someone is not doing their testing, basically, and you make it public enough, people will start doing their testing. No one likes to be on the red and have everyone else see it all the time. Now, also another thing that will help you if you modify your process goes about CI and CD. Hopefully all of you know what CI and CD is, but if not, it's continuous integration and continuous deployment or delivery. Basically, that means that you have a Jenkins or a similar type of system that whenever a commit is being done or a push is being done, then the whole product is being built and is being tested. Now, the problem with this is that most of the time, by tested, people mean unit tested. Okay, so my new feature is going to be going over all of my unit testing, and all the unit tests might be passing and everything's going fine. But the most simple functional sanity test is going to fail terribly. And so the product is being broken while the build is still okay. So I don't think that you don't have the time, obviously. You don't need to include all of your functional automation in order to create a good CI/CD system. But you do need to think about it and include a little bit of a sanity test. One of the things that I've seen very, very good is actually to have a kind of API testing approach. The API testing approach is actually a pretty cool one because it adds more layers of complexity, more layers of integration, but it neutralizes the layer of the UI that usually is the more fragile that you have in there. Okay, so just make sure that CI and CD does not stop on the level of unit testing and include more and more varied levels of testing into your CI/CD process. And again, that comes into visibility because no one likes to break the code, the build, which means that I'm going to be doing my testing as well. Tip number 4, and the last one that we have in here, it's to make sure that you also redefine testing based on your needs. And if we are talking about developers helping on the testing tasks, one of the things that we can do in our favor is try to redefine testing in a way that we will be able to use the strongest points of developers in our favor, okay? Testing does not necessarily mean someone taking the code and checking it using the UI or running traditional test cases or test scripts or exploratory testing sessions. There are quite a lot of additional tests that we can actually do, or testing operations that we can do. For example, you know what? You may want to use those developers in order to help you increase the amount of integration testing, automatic integration testing that you have. You might want to understand that because of the nature of your product, it's more economic to be doing more testing in production and more testing on the production environment than it is to be doing pre-release. So you can have those developers adding more instrumentation and adding better alerts and adding better deployment systems that will help you to test in production and to be able to do something once you're actually testing in production. Redefine what you're calling testing, because at the end of the day, it doesn't really matter how many tests you run. It matters the appreciation of quality that your end users are going to be having. You're not testing in order to have test runs. You're not testing in order to increase the number of test cases that you're running. That's a complete different lecture. I'm not doing it today, but you need to understand why you're testing And once you understand what you're testing, try to apply as much power, apply as much work as you can on how to improve that part of the testing. So if you're working in a SaaS environment, it's trivial, for me at least. Work on instrumentation, work on quality in production, testing in production, quality in production. I really don't give a, let's say I don't care how you call it, as long as we're talking about the same thing. We need to focus more on long-range quality metrics and less on velocity and less on test coverage, okay? So redefine testing in a matter that will provide more value to your team, more value to your customers. And one of the things that I really, really like is the way that by defining, I like and hate it, because I hate people who spend a lot of time fighting about definitions of words. I think that it's more about the meanings of words. But sometimes the definition helps to understand the meaning of something. And something happened to me about 6 months ago. Jerry Owen, she works on quality tests now. She's been doing testing and talking about testing for quite a long time. And she was talking on one of the online test comps that we had before. And she said something that just opened my eyes and blew me away. She went and defined test quality as customer happiness. And once you start framing quality as customer happiness, and you start defining testing as those operations that will help you to ensure that there's better customer happiness, or there's more customer happiness at the end, then you start understanding why we're here doing the work that we're doing. Okay, so reframe, redefine testing in a way that will actually meet your needs. Now, these are the tips in order to help developers test better. But there are still some pitfalls, okay? Even if you follow all the stuff that we've been talking about today, there are still some things that you need to watch out that will come and will happen. And even if they come and happen, then there are things that you can actually do. For example, if you hear developers saying, hey, you know what, I have more important tasks to do. Sorry, I would really love to help you testing, but this is more important and I need to go ahead and do it. You're talking here about priorities, and priorities need to be defined by management. And management needs to draw the line when testing is important and it's important enough so the developer is going to be doing it, or when they're just not talking the walk. If they don't walk the talk, then you have a problem with that. And if the mantra is going to be, sorry, I'd really like to help you out, but I have more important things to do, then you need to make sure that management helps people to set priorities straight. A lot of times we hear people saying, hey, sorry, I'd love to test, but I really don't know how to do it. I've never done it in my time. So don't give up. Continue teaching and guiding them. You're not doing it for them. You're doing it for yourselves, okay? You need to change the hat that you're wearing from being a tester into being a coach, into being a teacher, into being a guide, into being a consultant. If you're going to be doing all the testing, then you're not going to be having other people testing, and you need to become a teacher in order to teach people how to test. A lot of times you're going to be hearing someone that you gave them a feature to test, you know, that should take them a couple hours, and after 15 minutes they come and say, hey, you know what, I'm done testing. Thank you very much. Go ahead and do whatever you want. Take the time, do a peer review, do a walkthrough. Have patience. Sometimes developers, when they test, behave like kids doing their homework. They will just dribble a lot of numbers in there in order to try to fool you and think that you're too busy in order to notice. Spend the time, do those peer reviews, do those walkthroughs, go ahead and help them out. And maybe the most important part, if you hear someone that says, hey, I really need help with these test cases, you should not go into that trap of saying, hey, you know what, don't worry, I'm going to be doing them for you, or sitting down, taking the keyboard and the mouse and doing it for them. Yes, you can do peer testing sessions, but many times you will want to ask questions. Okay, where can I help you? What questions do you have? And point to those resources. Make sure that people understand testing is part of the profession. They need to develop profession. They need to learn how to do it. They need to research how to do it. And they need to also to learn by themselves. Okay, the same way that if they learn in a new language to write code, then they're going to start checking out how to do it and playing with themselves, playing on how to do it. They need to do the same with testing. You cannot do it for them. You need to help them do it better. If you do it for them all the time, then they're not going to learn how to do it. Okay? So to summarize, and hopefully we will be able to move to questions very quickly. Developers can test. Developers should test. Developers are testing, and developers are going to be testing more. Anyone who tells you that developers cannot test, it's either a fool, a liar, or a person who still is living on the 80s, okay? So tell them that even Bon Jovi changed their haircuts, and they need to change themselves. Developer can test and should be testing. Developer testing needs to come from the top down. Management needs to be together with you on this. They need to push this effort. They need to understand that it's important, and they need to be willing to walk the talk and not only talk. Even when developers want to test, even when management wants them to test, there are going to be real issues that you need to approach in order for testers to test correctly. Don't think that it's only a matter of they don't want to test. Sometimes they do have issues and you will need to talk about it. And the best way to approach these issues is by providing enough developer training and guidance, and by having the things that they need in order to test better. And even when everything works okay, there are going to be pitfalls, there are going to be stuff to look for, and there are going to be corrections that you need to make in order to adapt this to your team, to your product, to your development environment, to your developers, okay? So be aware of those pitfalls and make sure that you're here in order to tackle them when they present themselves. And with this, I'm actually done. And I'd love to hear what you have to say. If you have questions, I can try to answer them. If you have comments, I'd love to hear them. And I'd love to stop speaking. So Anna, Nalima, how do we move forward from here?
Thank you, Joel. And so as we mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, the audience members can go to the Slack channel to ask any questions that they might have or praise you on a great presentation. And as we mentioned, you can register for Contest NYC taking place November 14th to 16th, also in the Slack channel.
Okay. So I guess that we're moving to the Slack channel, right?
That is correct. So we'll end the session here and continue the conversation over there.
Okay, guys, so one